Okay, I think we are up and running here. Let me check. And it looks like it. Hey Daniel, Brendan, how are you guys doing today? Jonathan, how are you? Just read your DBQ. Not too bad. So, hey Luke, hope you got my email that I sent you earlier today about your DBQ. What the heck? All right. Hey Mark, how are you doing? I know I'm running a little bit late. My computer decided to update right as I opened up my OBS, my software that I use to, live stream this. So had to wait for that to update. So everything's kind of slow right now. Hey Kelly, how are you doing today? Again, I'm just going to wait a few moments here to let anybody in who wants to get in, and then we're going to go. Hey Nada, how are you doing? Yeah, I'm doing all right. Now that now that we've got some closure on what the heck the rest of the school year is going to look like. I don't know if you guys have heard or saw, but Governor Abbott today closed all schools for the rest of the year. So this is how we're going to finish out the year. All right. Sheltering in place away from each other. Hey, Amon. Abby, how are you guys doing today? Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in. Hey, Amon, I'd like to get some writing from you, maybe. Please send me some DBQ stuff. Or any of you guys who haven't done that. Nada, I don't think you've sent me anything yet. Mark, I don't believe you have either. It would be nice to get some things so I could provide you some feedback on things. So, Maya, how are you doing today? Again, I don't believe you've sent me any DBQ. I mean, if you think you got it, you got it. But I'm thinking for the most part you don't. So all of you guys who are stalling out there for whatever reason, I can't give you any help if I don't know what you're doing. All right? Kind of being stern about this, but, I would rather have you ready to go for May 21st than not. All right? Eric, Caden, Faith, how are you guys doing? Well, Amon, then finish the blame thing. I don't know what your stall is. You only needed 30 minutes. Good Lord. So just finish it. Man. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I've waited long enough, I guess. Just so you know, those of you who have come in a little bit later, just so you know that Governor Abbott has definitely called school off for the rest of the year. Well, not called school off. It's just that we won't be going to any sort of school buildings for the rest of the year. All right, so this is the way we're going to do it, and I'm going to continue doing the things that we have been doing when it comes to lecturing. All this stuff is being recorded and it is on my YouTube channel, so you can take a look at it. The Zoom from the DBQ on Monday is in Canvas. That's where that is located. I can't, so please check on it from there. For those of you who are in here who haven't done the DBQ, please, I can't give you any help if you don't send me anything, and don't tell me you don't have time, all right? It takes 45 minutes, okay? And on Monday, we're going to have a brand new DBQ for you to write and for me to provide you feedback. It's the only way we can get this done and get it right, so we're all ready to go by May 21st. Okay, let's get going. So today we're going to still be dealing with these maritime empires and how they link regions together. And when I say link regions, I'm not only talking about the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere here. We're taking a look at Europeans linking those regions of Southeast Asia to Europe now for the first time. And we're going to get this huge global connection here, nothing like we have seen before. So our essential question today is, how were the empires of European states established between 1450 and 1750, and what economic and labor systems fueled them? So, of course, when you hear that, we're going to be taking a look at the African slave system and things of that nature. Now, European nations at this time were driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries. And as they competed, they began to establish trading posts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And they also wanted to trade luxury goods for silver and gold with the Asians. Now, one thing to keep in mind, that the American colonies at this time were primarily agriculturally based, and we're talking North America and we're talking South America here, or Latin America and the Caribbean. And the plantation systems that were established definitely depended on what we call forced labor or coerced labor. These people probably didn't want to work this type of labor, but they were forced into it. They didn't have a choice. All right. So, of course, the growth of this plantation economy is going to lead to, more slavery and things of that nature. All right. That just closed down on me. Come on. All right. Here we go. Maybe. Most definitely. Okay. So, as you take a look at what I have put up here in front of you, we're going to take a look at state building and empire expansion in the world during this time period of 1450 to 1750. All right. Trading posts in Africa and Asia were huge. And the first ones to really go out and do it, of course, were the Portuguese. And the Portuguese didn't look to expand their empire, gain land, grab huge amounts of territory. The Portuguese were all about setting up trading posts, and they became very, very wealthy at doing this. And also some local rulers in Africa here traded slaves for gunpowder and cannons. And eventually it would turn into rum were being traded for slaves. And the thing is, it gave these coastal governments in Africa a lot of power. It gave them a military advantage so they could go conquer other tribes in the interior of Africa. And when they would conquer other tribes, they would, take prisoners of war, and they were taken back out to the coast, and they were then again sold into slavery to the Europeans. Now, this kingdom of right here, Dahomey or Dahomey, I'm not real sure how that is pronounced, but it really doesn't matter there. It grew very powerful during this time period. And as you see, all the way up into the 19th century, it was very, very powerful because it raided other villages to enslave people and sold them to, Europeans. So the Europeans this was a huge slave trading port for the Europeans during this age. All right. Also with state building here, Japan, as the Europeans were, in Japan, and as the Europeans were expanding their trade networks, Japan was beginning to restrict these trade networks, right after 1450. Early on, the Japanese had tolerated early Dutch and Portuguese missionaries, and thousands of Japanese converted to Christianity. But the problem here was, as we've seen through history, Christians at this time were very intolerant of other religions. So they, destroyed Buddhist temples and shrines. And in response, the Japanese government in 1587 said, okay, we're done with you guys. Stop. Get the heck out of here. We do not want you any here. They banned Christian worship services, and over the next 40 years, after 1587 into the mid-1600s, they took additional steps to persecute Christians and limit this Western influence. And as this slide shows you, it's the idea that they would crucify monks or crucify or execute those who had converted to Christianity and wouldn't turn back. Okay, so by 1630, the Japanese had expelled all of the Westerners out of Japan. They banned foreign books and prohibited Japanese citizens from traveling abroad, especially to the West. And so over the next two centuries in Japan, they were partially isolated. They weren't 100% isolated because they did allow the Dutch to come in and trade in the port of Nagasaki. And they were also able to trade with the Chinese at this point. So we see Japan, like China, become, just this turning inward. They don't want this outside influence, in their culture. But of course, as we know, that's not gonna stay. So China, here we're going to do a little bit, talk a little bit about China here. After the voyages of Zheng He, they turn inward as well. The Ming Dynasty restricts trade to limit outside influences. They're not just trading everywhere, across the world at this time. They restrict it because they don't want those outside influences. They banned private foreign trade. A merchant just couldn't go out and set up trade on his own. They destroyed some of the dockyards there, so they couldn't do it. They began repairing the Great Wall because, again, they were fearing the Mongols to the north. Okay, and they did re-emphasize the importance of the civil service exam here, the importance of what Confucianism meant to their society. So here we have Japan and we have China really beginning to turn inward, focus on their own culture, focus on their own belief systems, keep that Western influence out. And as, the Japanese said, we need to kick the foreign devils out is what one of their mantras there. All right, so by the mid-18th century, and we're talking 1750 here, France and Great Britain, along with their allies, competed for power on 5 different continents here. All right. The British East India Company established forts on the coast of India, and they took advantages of the tension between the Muslims and the Hindus here. And it increased their political power through treaties with local leaders. And ultimately, the East India Company would intervene in India politically and military, and they would completely control much of the subcontinent of Asia here. And the British would then establish this global network in Africa, in Asia, and the Americas. And the red here represents where the British had established control. The British Empire was huge at this time, and there was a saying out there that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because wherever the sun was, it was on one part of the British Empire somewhere. All right, so let's take a look at the Europeans in the Americas as well. So before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, the Aztecs and the Incans boasted a population of about 10 to 15 million people. But of course, with the introduction of these these Eastern diseases, smallpox, malaria, influenza, we know that these populations plummeted. The Aztecs were conquered by 1521, and the Spanish set up what we call New Spain. And the Spanish did melt down all the Aztec treasures, and they sent them back to Europe. Mexico City was established on the ruins of Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco. And by 1572, the Spanish had defeated the Incan Empire as well. So both of the largest empires that the Americas had seen, especially in Latin America, were now gone for the most part. And early on in the Americas, we have Spain versus Portugal here. We have this rivalry between these two Western European nations. And again, you take a look at where they're located. They're right beside each other up here on the Iberian Peninsula. And then they had to have some sort of an agreement. And they went to the Pope in 1493 and they says, hey, we need help here because we're constantly fighting over the same lines of same resources in the same areas. So Spain, in 1494, they get what is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And Spain got the western side, and then Portugal got the east here. And as you can tell, Spain got the better end of the deal. Portugal gets this little bit of Brazil down here. And look, they get part of Greenland. Big deal. Not a whole lot going on over there. And Spain gets total control of where they can get control of here, outside of the French or outside of the British at this point. So Spain is able to establish the oldest continuous settlement in North America in St. Augustine, Florida. So if you ever make it to St. Augustine, Florida, you are in the city that is the longest continuous settlement in this part of the world. But Spain, of course, is not able to control all of North America here. They compete with the French and the Dutch and the British. They're all making claims in North America as well. All right, so other Europeans in the Americas, we have the French and the British. And, of course, those guys don't like each other too well, and we end up with the 7 Years' War or the French-Indian War. In North America, it's called the French-Indian War. In Europe, it is called the 7 Years' War. They're fighting in Europe, and they're also fighting in the New World. So between 1754 and 1763, the British are able to drive the French out of most of North America and also out of India. And of course, as we know, this war would have further consequences, in the Americas as we move towards, American independence. But it's because the British government wants the colonists to pay for, their part of the 7 Years' War. All right, so what are some continuities and changes in economic systems here? Even though the Europeans increased their influence in the Indian Ocean trading network, it continued business as usual, all right? The Indian Ocean trading network did not stop. You still had the Chinese trading with the Indians trading with the Muslims, on the east coast of Africa there. That was always there. That never did stop, okay? So the trade was continuous. But who is in control of the trade? Who gave the most influence in this trade changed because we have the Portuguese and the Spanish coming in there, and then eventually the Dutch would take over areas of Southeast Asia down there in Java. But then again, keep in mind that the rest of it, trading just continued on as before, so we don't see that change. Also, continuity, some more continuity and changes here. Spain and gold in the Americas, of course, where Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, Hispaniola, there was little gold to be found. So wanting to return home with something valuable, Christopher Columbus took local Taino people back to Spain for slaves. He kidnapped them, and he took them back and said, hey, look at this valuable resource. I've got North American Indians. Well, he didn't think he was in North America. He didn't even know where he was. He thought he was still in East Asia somewhere. And he says, look, I found these people. Now they're our slaves, all right? Then in the early 1500s, once they got established in the New World, they set up this system called the encomienda system. And it was basically where landowners forced locals to work for them in exchange for food and shelter. And it's very similar to the manorial system in Europe during feudalism with the serfs. So this idea of coercive systems does become the norm. It is very much a continuity throughout this time period. It doesn't change. The people who are in the labor force change, but the idea of violent or the idea of forced labor does not change. That exists for primarily most of the time period that we're talking about here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about each of these areas here. We're going to talk about silver here. So silver is primarily coming from Latin America in the Andes Mountains, because the gold from the Americas never really amounted to much. It didn't generate a whole lot of profit. So silver becomes the profit generator, especially for the Spanish. And we have a mountain in Latin America down there in Argentina in the Andes Mountains. It's called Potosi. And this thing is a huge, huge silver mine. And once the Spanish were able to figure out how to get the silver out of this mountain, it just becomes this huge thriving center in present-day Peru. And the Spanish, we'd already talked about this, they take a hold of the Mita system. The Mita system is the system that existed in the Incan Empire. And it was basically where if you had to build a road, and this thing called Incan socialism, hey, I need 5 guys from this village, 5 guys from this village, and we're going to go work 3 days to repair this road. Okay, they would go work 3 days, hopefully repair the road, and that's all they had to commit to it. But the Spanish kind of tap into that. They go, okay, I need this many men from this village and this many men from this village to go work in the silver mines. And they go, well, how long are we going to work there for? Oh, I don't know, until the work is done. Okay, and it was a very cruel and it was very harsh. So the amount of silver that came out of this mountain really strengthened the Spanish economy due to the fact that European nations were developing this idea of mercantilism. And the main purpose for the Spanish colonies was to supply as much gold and silver as possible. And of course, this made the Spanish government very, very rich because they got a percentage of that silver that was mined out. Okay, so another part of this continuity and change in labor systems, the Europeans were seeking out sources of inexpensive labor. Indigenous peoples were very, very expensive. They were very, very inexpensive. And as we know, they would eventually die off, or they could run away because they knew the land. So they went to Africa to get slaves. Now, Portugal was the first to, take slaves out of Africa. And initially, they took them to Europe to be house slaves. None of this agricultural work. And you have to always keep in mind that the slave trade already existed in Africa. It was always there. Africans were enslaving Africans, prisoners of war, debtors, things of that nature, things that we have seen before. So for Europeans, if you owned land, and that's what they wanted to do in, North America and South America, and you owned slaves, that is a sign of wealth and power. All right. Now, what makes this slave trade different was that this trade wreaked havoc. It just destroyed some long-lasting or living cultures in Africa at the time. Okay, so why do we choose Africans? Why did the Europeans go get Africans? Well, initially, as I said before, the Europeans used indigenous labor to supply their needs on the plantations. Well, as I said, they died or they escaped. And in North America, they used the indentured servants. And after, 7-10 years, depending on what the contract was, the indentured servants were let go. All right. So the landowners in America didn't believe the system was efficient. It was costing them a lot of money. They were losing a lot of people. So why Africa? Well, if you take a look at this map, it's geographically close. The slave trade already existed. The Europeans didn't have to do the dirty work to go in and capture the slaves. That was being done for them by the local, coastal kingdoms of Africa. So it made sense to the Europeans at the time. All right. And, the horrors of that journey, that middle passage, this where it says African slaves there, that is your middle passage. And the journey was horrible. All right. The captured slaves were taken out of the interior of Africa. They were taken to the coast where they were held in holding pens. And these holding pens were called barracoons or slave castles. And they were crammed into these cargo holds of ship. They provided them just enough food to survive the middle passage. Some slaves did try to rebel, but for the most part, they were, these rebellions on ships were crushed. And at times, up to half of the Africans would die in this 6-week voyage from Africa to the Americas. And of course, over the course of 400 years of the Atlantic slave trade, 10 to 15% of the captives died before reaching the Americas. And I think the number of Africans that were brought from Africa to the New World, the estimates are somewhere around 10 million. So if you're talking 10 to 15%, you're talking over 1 million people dying on the route to the Americas just because, it was horrible and the conditions were terrible, little food. All right. And this is just a chart that shows you where the Africans, where the Africans were taken in the New World, all right, in different time periods here. These demographic and social and cultural changes, the physical migration and significant impact on the populations and demographics of Africa. The continued exploration of Africans led to exportation of Africans led to population decline. Free person to slave, that's a huge change. Families are disrupted in Africa. More men are taken from women. You get polygyny. Taking on more than one wife becomes normal, or becomes common in Africa because of the high difference in ratio of men to women. You have a lot more women than you do men in Africa. And slavery was determined by supply and demand here, rather than kinship, due to chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the idea of buying and selling of slaves. But here, another thing that we need to think about here is that people that come from Africa, that have African roots, enrich the language and the culture of the societies in which they were brought into. Food, music, language, and we also see new racial groups forming in the mestizos and the mulattoes in Latin America due to the mixing of races at this time. All right, the Indian Ocean slave trade, yeah, that did exist. It wasn't as extensive, of course, as the Atlantic slave trade, and it existed a lot longer than what was going on in, than what was going on in the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't good. Anytime you put a person into slavery is not a good thing. Slaves in this network suffered a little bit differently than those in the Atlantic. They worked in seaports as laborers, household servants. Some served as sailors. Some were soldiers. All right. Some slaves who ended up in Islamic communities, had some rights. They had the idea they could get married as well. Asian culture transferred, culture transferred here as well. Musical styles and customs in the Middle East and India can be found to have African roots. We don't see this huge agricultural need for slaves in the Indian Ocean trade network. So that brings us to the end of this section. I know, yes, it was kind of long, but I think we did. How were they able to gain a lot of power? And we did see that. And then what economic and labor systems fueled them. Without these economic and labor systems, maybe they wouldn't have become so powerful. I don't know. So let's take a couple of moments to break, grab some water, shake out your hand, and we'll get started on the next one here in a few moments. As you can see, this one isn't quite as long. All right. All right, let me get it pulled up here on my phone, and we will get started here. Let me see. Here we go. Maybe if it gets pulled up here on my phone. Good Lord, it's really slow. Oh, here we go. Okay, so let's get going. All right, so the question here is, what economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power, and how did developing empires affect political, economic, religious, and cultural dynamics. Okay, guys, you have to make sure you understand what those words are. Political, government, economic, trade, commerce, money, religious, very cultural, and cultural dynamics can mean anything from language and literature and education, and of course religion can be put in there as well. So we see these maritime empires, they develop empires, they transform commerce, they transform trade into from local small trading to this large international trade, using of gold and silver. We start to see the use of what we call joint stock companies here, in which investors finance trade by buying shares in corporations such as the East India Company, and it lessens your risk. You don't take on everything. If it fails, you're only out the amount of money you put in. You're not responsible for everything. New trade routes were open, mixing of African American and European cultures and people. Silver, sugar, and slaves were the key to the development of these new economies and these mercantilist empires here. All right, so economic strategies here. So in the 17th century, European nations measured their wealth in the amount of gold and silver they had here. Sell more goods to other countries than you have to import. That is, the basic bare bones, class 101 on what mercantilism is. All right, the accumulation of capital, material wealth, is to produce more wealth than the other guy. All right, lending money at high interest rates becomes commonplace. Before then, it really had not. We see this commercial revolution take place. The transformation to a trade-based economy using gold and silver money is known as the commercial revolution. All right, 4 factors causes this revolution across the world. All right, number 1, development of European colonies. Okay, you need European colonies for this commercial revolution to exist. And opening of new ocean trade routes. Okay, you have much more trade going on. That's number 2. Number 3, population growth. You have more people to sell things to, and you also have a larger working group of people. And then inflation. The more money that is out on the market, the more inflation will increase. So it produces a general rise in prices. The more money that's out there, prices are going to go up. And this is known as the price revolution, okay? People say, well, why don't we put just more money into the economy to help, lessen our debt? Guys, that's not going to help. Yeah, we're going to have more money, but that just means prices are going up. And your money is not worth as much. And this is what happens in the commercial revolution. You see inflation start to begin to happen because of the more and more gold and silver there is. All right. So again, earlier I said you had the formation of joint stock companies. And these are people invest. They invest they buy shares into these companies and say, hey, I want to put in $50, and if you make money, I will get more than my $50 back after I sell. They share the profits as well as the risk. So, if it works out really well for them, if it's very profitable, you're going to make a lot of money. You offer this limited liability. Investors are not responsible for all of the debt or other liabilities beyond their amount of their investment. So at the most, if you put in $50 to buy a share and that's all you buy, you're only going to lose $50 if it doesn't work out for you. But if you invest $50 and they continue to increase profits over and over and over and over and over again, that $50 can turn into hundreds, if not thousands of dollars here. You have 2 main ones at this time. You have the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And these things were the driving force behind these sea-based empires. They made enormous profits for their countries and their investors. The Dutch had an early stock exchange in 1609. They create what is called the Bank of Amsterdam. They trade currency internationally. The Dutch standard of living at this time was the highest in the world, in all of Europe. All right, goods such as diamonds and linen and pottery and tulip bulbs, we saw that in a video this year, passed through the hands of Dutch traders. So it was very, very, a very, very, nice place to live in Europe at this time. All right, and again, part of the commercial revolution is this triangular trade system. And as you can see by it, types of things that went out of the New World back to Europe: whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, silk was being grown in North America or being produced, indigo and tobacco, sugar, molasses, and wood, were taken to Europe and they were manufactured into luxury products. And then they were taken to Africa and they were sold to bring slaves over to the New World. All right. Gold, ivory, spices, hardwoods came out of Africa. So you see this triangular trade. It is happening all across the Atlantic at this time, and it is making the Europeans very, very wealthy. One of the changes here were the beginning of the creations of what we call monopolies here. They granted certain merchants the exclusive right to trade in certain areas. All right. For example, the Spanish government established a monopoly over all the tobacco grown domestically and in the American colonies. And this made up a third of their wealth, of their total revenues of the Spanish Empire. They says, hey, we're going to control it all, and we are going to take all of the revenue for it. That is a monopoly. You control everything about it. So that is a change here. A continuity here. The traditional regional trade markets still existed here in Afro-Eurasia. You still have the Silk Road. You still have the Trans-Saharan. You still have the Indian Ocean Trade Network. That doesn't change. That continues. But the amount of product that was exchanged or traded for, and the speed that trade happened at increased due to better shipping technology. So what are some of the effects of the Atlantic trade here? Of course, some of the effects, and we've already talked about this, it weakened several West African kingdoms, such as the Congo, loss of people, slowed population growth. Competition for trade led to violence among societies here. African slave-raiding kingdoms became economically dependent on goods from Europe. They needed Europe. And of course, this would eventually set the stage for European imperialism here. Some African slave-raiding societies, such as Dahomey, which I talked about in my last lecture, they became richer because they exchanged guns for trade, and they were for slaves, and they were able to take over other tribes very, very easily with this gunpowder and this weaponry they had. Intergroup warfare became more prominent in Africa. Tribes against tribes, and if one tribe won, well, your people were taken prisoner and you may have been sold into slavery. Gender balance occurs here. In some areas, 2/3 of those taken were men, and of course this leads to polygamy, and it also leads to roles that men traditionally held were now being held by women in Africa. And then, of course, we have the transfer of, food and music to the New World. All right. The Spanish and the Portuguese empires managed to erase the basic social structure and cultural traditions of the areas they landed in. All right, which was very unlike earlier societies of the Romans, the Muslims, and the Mongols. They didn't destroy the culture that was there. All right, but when the Spanish and the Portuguese came in, they did. Political changes that occurred, you have the Spanish viceroys, okay? And the Spanish established courts here, and Spanish settlers could appeal to a viceroy's decision. So there was some rule of law. But remember, the King of Spain controlled these areas here. But again, slow communication between Spain and the colonies made it difficult for the Spanish crown to exercise direct control here. But we do see this, and this type of political control here is very different than what we see in North America. And of course, that difference is what's going to lead, the American colonists to rebel. All right, cultural changes. Conquistadors came over. They ordered the burning of native books, which were thought to be unholy. So historians had very little to go with on what the indigenous cultures were really, really like. Much of it was based on what the Spanish wrote down. And of course, they definitely have a different point of view than what the indigenous people would have. The Spanish and Portuguese transplanted their own languages and religions into the Americas. And by 1750, those born in the Americas of Spanish origin or Creoles, which which they are called, enjoy political dominance. And as you can see by these areas or these maps here that I've shown you who controlled what, and you can see that the Spanish and Portuguese control most of Latin America. And then, of course, Catholic affiliation in Latin America, a very high percent are Catholic due to these early conquistadors who begin to establish their way of life in Latin America. All right, so what are the effects of some of these belief systems here? What does Catholicism do in Latin America? So you start to see these syncretic, these blending of belief systems in the Americas due to this increased global connection. Religions begin to blend beliefs and practices. Africans melded aspects of Christianity with religious African, traditions such as drumming, dancing, and beliefs and spirits that could take over and act through a person. This religion is called Santeria. Vodun and Candomblé are some religions that occur because of this interaction. In the Americas, 1 of 10 slaves practiced Islam. So we see the introduction of Islam in the Americas here. As Christianity spreads into Latin America, the cult develops around the dark complexion of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is revered for her ability to perform miracles. This was not part of the Catholic tradition until it gets to the New World here. All right, so that brings us to the end of this one. We have one more to go. So take a couple of moments and gather yourself, and we'll get finished up here in a few moments. I do appreciate all you guys sticking around for this. I know this is kind of long on a Friday afternoon. But we're going to get done. This PowerPoint is only 6 slides long. So I know you're tired and you want to get done for a Friday afternoon, and I totally get it. So let me see here. Here we go. Again, I hope everyone is staying safe and, everyone is staying sane. That's for sure. We're going to get through this. I promise you. If you follow me on, the way we do the DBQs, you're going to be fine. But you still need to give me examples of what you're writing, all right? So I can grade it. And I do turn those around, pretty fast of those that do know, who have sent me stuff. And I think some of you are quite surprised that you do know what to do. But we do need to practice, okay? Almost ready to go here. Yes. Okay. What? Cancel. No, I don't want that. Yes. Okay. Ugh. Why is this doing this? Okay, here we go. Okay, so as empires develop, we're going to take a look at how did the development of state power result in external and internal challenges in this period between 1450 and 1750, because not everyone agreed with what they were doing. Okay, not everyone looked at the state and they go, hey, you're doing a great job. Now I'm going to say a majority of the people probably did, but we also have to take a look at how did people challenge these ideas of what the state was doing internally inside the country, and how did people outside of the country challenge that state power. And that's what we're going to take a look at here today in these few short slides. All right, so excuse me, we do have some resistance to Portugal in Africa at the time. They didn't all just go willingly. They resisted, and one of the most famous ones is Queen Nzinga of Ndongo in South Central Africa. She offers this haven for runaway slaves, and she ruled for decades, and she is able to resist Portugal here and builds this economically strong and independent state. As you can see here, this is Queen Nzinga here, and she has one of her servants bow down and create a chair for her to sit on as she negotiates with the Portuguese ruler there, the Portuguese conquistador there. You know, she hand selected. What she used to do is she would hand select soldiers who would infiltrate, who pretended to be defectors. They'd go, hey, you know, we don't like her so much anymore. We're going to go and defect to you, Portuguese. But they were lying to the Portuguese here so they could infiltrate Portuguese armies and create dissent from within. And once inside Portuguese ranks, they would attack. So Queen Nzinga hugely resisted European control here for several decades. Okay. All right, let's take a look at Russia here. We do see some resistance here, and we talked about this guy in class a little bit. You know, for centuries, Russian serfs had been long oppressed. They had to give heavy tribute and taxes required from the peasants to the Russian princes, and of course to the Russian leaders like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or Ivan the Terrible, whoever was, you know, in power at the time. Well, we have this Cossack here, and a Cossack is a fierce Russian warrior here, and of course he is a peasant. He is not part of the nobility, and his name is Pugachev. Okay, and he begins this rebellion against Catherine the Great in 1774. You know, he even says that to get more power, he says, hey, I'm the dead husband of Catherine the Great. I really didn't die. Here I am. And I'm here, you know, forming this rebellion against Catherine the Great because what she's doing is wrong. Because I'm ticked off that she said I was dead and now she has my power. Okay? So people thought he should have been the true emperor of Russia at the time. And, you know, he fights this idea because Catherine the Great gave more power to the nobility and rights to the land, and of course that upsets, you know, anybody, you know, that farms the land. They don't have control of it. They're just farming it to, you know, feed others here. So he gathers the support from these ticked off peasants, all right, and other fellow Cossacks and other diverse ethnicities that are in the area, and they would gain a large control of land in the Russian Empire. But within a year, the Russian army, you know, captures Pugachev. And, you know, with this rebellion, Catherine does not trust the peasants any longer. So she basically increases their oppression and increases the right of the nobles, gives them more rights to control the land, to stop, to avoid further results. And again, another thing that she does to Pugachev is that she wants to make sure this does not happen again in Russia. So after she captures Pugachev, she executes him, and then she has his body chopped up into different parts, and then she would take these parts to, no, she didn't do it herself, but she would have them taken these parts to different parts of the Russian Empire and, you know, placed on a stick with a sign that said, hey, this is the arm of Pugachev. If you decide to rebel against me, this could happen to you. You know, the arm over here, the head here, the torso here, the heart over here, one leg here. She did that all over the empire to stop people from, you know, potentially rebelling against her. Okay, we do have revolts in the Spanish Empire as well. Indigenous peoples did not take it too well that the Spanish were, you know, coming after them or trying to control them. We have what is called the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, and this is in present-day New Mexico. So if you go to New Mexico, you can just go, whoa, this is where the Pueblo Revolt happened. They fought colonizers who was trying to force them to become Christianity or become Christian. And again, it's that idea that when the Spanish and other Europeans come over, hey, look at us, we're Christian. This is the only true religion. Your religion is evil. Your religion is wrong. So here's Christianity. Take it. And, you have to take it. If you don't take it, well, we might execute you. We might imprison you. That was the idea of early Christian missionaries. And people didn't like it, just like these Pueblo, residents here. And 400 Spaniards, they killed 400 Spaniards, and you can tell in various ways by hanging them and then, placing them on fire probably here. They drove them out of the area, and they destroyed the churches that were in the area. But of course, as we know, the Spanish were able to get control back in about 1692, and then the indigenous North American, natives weren't able to fight back because of the superior weaponry that the Spanish brought along with them. Okay, let me see here. Oh, come on, there we go. All right, so African slaves, they fought back. In little ways. I'm not saying they had these huge rebellions that changed their lives forever. It changed lives for certain groups of people. So England had taken over control of Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655. And we call these the Maroon Wars. They occur in the Caribbean. And the Maroon Wars were descendants of runaway African slaves that had formed their own communities. Okay, they just let them live out in these communities. They didn't bother anybody, and they just let them go. So you have these maroon communities, and these maroon communities eventually would help, L'Ouverture of Haiti, defeat the French in Haiti, because the Maroons would come in and they helped him and the other escaped slaves. Okay, so they become very, very important. But that is a sign of challenging the state power. You run away and then you create your own communities. You're not listening to what the empire is telling you to do. In Virginia, we have what is called the Gloucester County Rebellion in Virginia in 1683. African slaves and indentured servants, white indentured servants, conspired together to demand their freedom. They challenged it, but they were found out, and then, of course, they were ambushed, and several of them were killed or executed. And then you have the Metacom's War in New England, and it was to drive the British out of New England from 1675 through 1678. And in the process of this 3 years, the local people, the local indigenous peoples, destroyed 12 towns in the process. But again, the English would gain control. All right. We also have struggles for power in England as well. In England itself, we have struggles for power. So this is an internal challenge to the state power. All right. Within England, you have what is called the Glorious Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution in 1685. James II was the king of England, and he was Catholic. So his policies enraged the Protestants. Remember, England was mostly a Protestant nation at the time. William of Orange, persuaded by the English nobility, invaded England. He came from, the mainland of Europe, and he eventually was able to defeat James II because he knew his force, William the Orange's force, was much more powerful than his. So James says, heck, I'm out of here, and he runs to France, where it was Catholic, and William and his wife are both Protestants, and they gain power. All right. What they do here is they strengthen the power of the Parliament, and they pass a law forbidding Catholics to rule England after this. Hey, you know what? We're not going to have any more Catholics control our nation here. So we see various things happen internally and externally. All right. People just didn't take it lying down. They did resist. So make sure you understand these these resistance to power here, because College Board loves to ask those types of questions. I don't know if you'll get the DBQ will have anything to do with it, but as long as you have background information from Maroon communities, Metacom War, the Pueblo Revolt, the Gloucester Rebellion, those types of words are very, very important, okay? Okay, guys, that's all I have for you today. On Monday, what I plan on doing is doing another Zoom lesson. I'll send you the link on Monday, and we're going to go over another DBQ. I think it's very, very important that we do, and maybe that day there, we will just sit, and if you're going to join me, you'll just sit and write it at that time, and it'll be all over and done with, and then we can just go from there. All right. So guys, continue to send me the DBQs from the Portuguese trade. I get them turned around as fast as I can, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job on keeping up with that. So you guys take care, and it breaks my heart that we will not all get back together this year. So please, do what you need to do. Stay safe, stay sane, and continue to work on your lessons, because that is what our expectation of you guys is. All right? Stay safe, sane, miss ya, and love ya. Have a great weekend. All right? Bye.